Most of the information out there talking about the advantages of full frame cameras over crop sensor cameras is just repeated misinformation. And I can't tell you how many of the big name YouTubers I've seen who've just kind of said things that they've heard or they thought were right, but really had no basis in fact at all. And because of that, there's a lot of people out there that maybe have a crop sensor camera and they're debating whether they should upgrade to a full frame camera, or maybe they're thinking about buying their next camera or their first camera. And they're using this information to base their decision. And because of that, they're probably not making the best decision for them. The first thing you're going to hear is full frame cameras perform better in low light conditions or in high ISO than crop sensor cameras. Now, it's important for me to state that this is actually false, but if you take the average crop sensor camera on the market right now and look at its performance in low light or high ISO conditions, if you look at your average full frame camera and how it performs in low light or high ISO conditions, on average, the full frame camera is going to outperform the crop sensor camera. But this is not true for every crop sensor camera compared to every full frame camera. There are crop sensor cameras that perform better than full frame cameras. There are crop sensor cameras that perform similarly to full frame cameras, and there are often crop sensor cameras that perform close enough that the difference probably wouldn't be material in your decision making about which camera you might go with. So when you are considering full frame versus crop sensor cameras, you have to understand that it isn't just a one-to-one. You don't automatically get better performance if you've got a full frame camera. You have to compare that crop sensor camera and its performance to the full frame camera and its performance. And I'm just going to throw some examples on screen now. First, I've got a video example. I'm comparing the Sony FX30 with Sony's latest crop sensor camera to the Canon EOS RP, which is a current model of Canon camera. You can still buy it, but it is an older model sensor. And this is really not a comparison that I would really normally do, but I'm just trying to demonstrate that it isn't the sensor size that gives you the better performance. And when we look at the video performance in particular, you can see that the FX30 has significantly better video performance in high ISO compared to the Canon EOS RP. Now we're going to actually look at the raw files. And when we compare the raw files, I think they are very, very similar. I probably would give the slight nod to the Canon EOS RP. You really are seeing that sort of bigger sensor shine in that situation. And then the next one we're going to look at is the JPEG files. And the reason I've got to compare all of these separately is because, as you can see, the performance is different. The video performance of the FX30 is better in these high ISO sort of situations, where the photography performance in RAW files is probably a little bit better in the Canon EOS RP. And then the JPEG is kind of very, very similar. And what you'll notice is with the Canon EOS RP, you're getting a little bit more noise, but you're getting a little bit more detail, where the Sony FX30 is actually trying to get rid of that noise, is working a little bit harder to get rid of that noise, but then it's kind of removing the detail a little bit. So between these two, it is really virtually a wash when you compare the JPEGs to each other. But this just stands to demonstrate that it isn't the sensor size that's determining the quality of the high ISO or low light performance of these cameras. There's a lot more that goes into it. And if you're comparing a crop sensor to a full frame camera, make sure you're comparing those two cameras to each other, not just assuming that the full frame sensor is going to get you better performance. Now, the next thing you're going to hear is that full frame cameras allow you to get a more blurry background and better subject isolation and shallower depth of field than you can get with a crop sensor camera. And this is true, but probably not for the reason that you think. See, a full frame camera has a wider field of view. It can see wider. So if you got a crop sensor camera and a full frame camera and they both have 50mm lenses on them, and you're going to take a portrait of somebody, when you set up that framing with the crop sensor camera, you're going to have to get further back. With the full frame camera, you can get closer. The closer you are to your subject, the more blurry your background becomes. So it is the fact that the camera has a wider field of view that allows you to get closer that actually gets you a more blurry background. It has nothing to do with the sensor size or any sort of magic in the lenses. It's simply the position of the camera in relation to the subject that you're taking a photo or video of. And here's just an example of what I'm talking about. I've taken 3 shots here, all with a full frame camera and a 50mm f1.8 lens. First, I was further away from the subject, and just look at how blurry the camera is in the background. Then I got a little bit closer, and you'll see that camera gets a little bit blurrier, and then I got closer yet, and the camera got blurrier yet. So the closer I got to the subject, the more blurry that background or that camera in the background became. Now, normally, if you were going to hold your same position and you're shooting with a full frame camera in sort of one position, and you want to take that same shot in that same frame with the same position with a crop sensor camera, what you're going to do is you're going to use a different lens. So here's an example of that. In the one I've shot with a full frame camera with a 50mm f1.8 lens, and then the other one I've shot with a crop sensor camera with a 35mm f1.8 lens. And this is another thing that determines how shallow your depth of field is or how blurry your background is, and that is the focal length of the lens that you're using. So in this case, a 50mm on full frame has a similar field of view to 35mm on crop sensor, but 35mm, since it is a smaller number, has a less blurry background by default. That's just how it works. And if you see these two photos and you look at the bokeh balls or the specular highlights in the background, what you'll see is in the one that we've got the crop sensor camera and the 35mm, those bokeh balls or those sort of out of focus areas are slightly smaller, around 30% smaller, which is the difference between the two lenses going from a 35mm to a 50mm lens. Now, when we compare these two images, what I would say is, in practical terms, looking at these two images, the background is blurry enough in both of the photos that it's kind of irrelevant. Once it gets to a certain level of blur and you've got that subject isolation, it probably doesn't matter. Where the full frame camera actually shines is when you're further away from your subject, or when you're shooting with a lens that might be an f2.8 lens instead of an f1.8 lens. That's when that sort of wider field of view, the ability to get closer to your subject and get a little bit more black background blur is going to allow you to give that sort of subject isolation that you aren't necessarily going to be able to get with a crop sensor camera. So while those are the technical differences between a crop sensor camera and a full frame camera, that's not the way I'm actually seeing things play out in real life. Because the crop sensor camera is about half the price of the full frame camera, and comparable high quality lenses for the crop sensor camera are about half the price of the full frame camera lenses. So when we actually compare these apple to apples and we're dealing with dollars, for what you would spend on a full frame camera with a kit lens, you're going to be able to buy a crop sensor camera with a kit lens and 2 high quality f1.4 prime or fixed lenses. And that camera combination with those 2 premium lenses is going to get you significantly better photo and video and better results overall for the exact same price. So this is really only a fair apples to apples comparison, and that full frame sensor really only comes in and becomes a factor if you're able to afford spending twice as much money on the camera body, and then once you've done that, spend twice as much money on an f1.4 lens to go with that camera. And I think this is really critical because I don't think a whole lot of people are actually in that position when they're comparing these two systems. And I think most people that stretch themselves for a full frame camera are going to end up stuck with a full frame camera in the kit lens, rather than a crop sensor camera with 2 high quality premium lenses, maybe f1.4, maybe f1.2, that is going to get you significantly better results. And recently what we're seeing is the release of a number of very high quality, very fast f1.2, t1.0, f0.95 lenses for crop sensor cameras at an affordable price that actually goes very close to bringing both the image quality, the ability to get an out of focus background, and the low light performance. These new lenses are bringing the crop sensor cameras very close in performance to the full frame cameras. And they're doing that, and at the same time, those lenses are still half the price. And in the description down below, I'll put a list of crop sensor lenses that I think negate many of the advantages that full frame cameras have with full frame lenses. So sort of check that out. I'll have it for all the different brands, Sony, Nikon, Fuji, what have you. And if you're a crop sensor shooter already and you're looking for some ultra low budget lenses to really upgrade the quality of your photos and videos? I've just shown a video on screen now. This has got some incredible lenses starting at $20.